Hi everybody, welcome to the Worthy and Unworthy News channel. On this channel we talk about geopolitical events and present them from a perspective a little bit different from that usually offered by the mainstream media. In this video titled The Primrose Path, The Risk of Being a US Ally, I talk about some recent developments in terms of the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, and talk about how these changes are not really unprecedented when you look at the relationship between the United States and its allies historically. A few weeks ago, we were treated to the sight of President Zelensky of Ukraine being publicly dressed down by President Trump and Vice President Vance. The two listed a number of complaints against the Ukrainian leader, particularly related to Zelensky supposedly not being grateful enough for U.S. military support. Much of the media coverage of this event focused on how unprecedented it was to see the United States publicly go after an ally in this way. In this video, I will discuss how this type of reversal or even betrayal is not something new, but is indeed a core part of U.S. foreign policy. The United States has a long history of betraying allies when such support is no longer in the U.S.'s interest. If Zelensky and other Ukrainian leaders had considered this history, it might have prevented them from walking down a primrose path that has had such a negative impact on Ukraine. To make this point, I'll discuss three specific examples of U.S. betrayal of allies. I'll start by talking about the situation in Southeast Asia, then I'll move forward to talking about Iraq during the first Gulf War, and I'll finish up by talking about Afghanistan. Well, this video does not seek to review the entire history of the Vietnam War and its broader impacts on Southeast Asia. To briefly review the facts, Vietnam was partitioned into a communist-allied North and a Western-allied South after the end of World War II. Following the end of French colonial control of the country, the U.S. stepped in as the main backer of the South. Despite South Vietnam being a supposed ally of the U.S., much of the bombing and destruction that happened during the war was not directed at the North, but rather on the South. The map on the screen shows bombs dropped during the war, and you can see there was a much higher concentration in the southern part of the country than the north. Such bombing was justified based on the presence of communist insurgents in the South, but it was civilians throughout the South who faced the largest impacts of this bombing. These impacts have outlasted the war itself. During the war, Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant, was deployed throughout the South, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so that insurgents could not use trees for concealment. This chemical has been linked to a wide variety of health impacts, including cancers. The figure on the screen is from a meta-analysis that summarizes the findings from different studies. It showed that exposure to Agent Orange was associated with a 200% greater risk of birth defects. Once again, it was the southern part of the country that faced the greatest impacts of the U.S.'s use of Agent Orange. The famous image on the screen shows efforts to evacuate people from Saigon during the fall of the city to the north in 1975. The building pictured is a CIA building. While this image has often been used to represent the efforts of the U.S. to support its allies during the end of the war, it belies the fact that thousands were left behind. Not just those who the United States had roped into its efforts during the war, but also children fathered by U.S. military personnel. This abandonment was felt by supposed allies in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. Vietnam's neighbor Laos faced a similar civil war during the same period as that in Vietnam. The U.S. also intervened in Laos, killing thousands of civilians. The CIA backed opposition to the communist forces in the Civil War, which has been referred to as the largest paramilitary operation ever undertaken by the CIA. These efforts focused specifically on the Hmong minority in the country. There are still ongoing questions about how the United States gained the support of the Hmong in the country. In particular, some have suggested that the United States promised ongoing support and a home for the Hmong if the intervention was unsuccessful. In the interesting study shown on the screen, the researchers contrasted the viewpoint that emerged from interviews with the Hmong, which suggested such promises were made, and some military officials, including those from the United States, who denied such promises. Among those Hmong who reported hearing those promises, there was a clear feeling of abandonment, with many being left to suffer in the waning days of the Civil War. They had been led down a primrose path by the Americans. Just a quick side note, the book that I'm showing on the screen right now, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, is a very interesting story that deals with Hmong minorities living in the United States and California. While the book does not focus specifically on these historical and political issues, it does discuss them. I will now move to another part of the world and discuss the Gulf War in 1991. I will leave it to another video to cover the details of this war, but instead focus on the U.S. leading some Iraqis down the Primrose Path during this war. The image on the screen shows the highway of death where the United States bombed retreating Iraqi columns, which included civilians following Iraq's expulsion from Kuwait at the end of the war. Then President George H.W. Bush, following this conclusion of the war, actively encouraged Iraqis to rise up against Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, saying, "There is another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside, and then comply with the United Nations resolutions and rejoin the family of peace-loving nations. Many in Iraq, particularly in Shiite and Kurdish parts of the country, listened to Bush's words and did indeed start an uprising against Saddam. I am not bringing this up to argue that the United States should have supported these uprisings, as many have, but rather to make the argument first that this call should not have been made in the first place, and second that this is just another example of the U.S. leading people down a Primrose path. Indeed, this was confirmed by Colin Powell, the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and later one of the architects of the criminal Iraq War of 2003, who wrote, "For a moment it looked as if the war might flare up again. In March, the Iraqi Shiites in the south rose up in arms to demand more recognition from Baghdad. Saddam responded by sending in his troops to suppress the uprising. In the north, the Kurds tried to shake off the Iraqi yoke. Neither revolt had a chance, nor frankly was their success a goal of our policy. President Bush's rhetoric, urging the Iraqis to overthrow Saddam, however, may have given encouragement to the rebels, but our practical intention was to leave Baghdad enough power to survive as a threat to an Iran that remained bitterly hostile toward the United States. You can see here clearly reflected the fact that countries who consider allying with the United States need to learn. The United States is always looking out for itself. In this case, the United States did not want to see Saddam overthrown because they needed him as a thorn in the side of the Iranians." We have more recent examples of this abandonment as well. On the screen, you can see the chaotic scenes from the Kabul airport in Afghanistan following the United States' swift withdrawal from the country as the Taliban took over. I bring this case up not because I oppose this withdrawal, which should have happened sooner. Indeed, the whole invasion was a mistake, which will need to be a topic of another video, but to show how the US has again abandoned supposed allies. With Trump's new immigration policies, there have been questions about whether refugees from Afghanistan, including those who supported the US occupation, will be able to enter the country, which has resulted in feelings of betrayal amongst many. So I hope it is clear that if the United States has indeed abandoned Ukraine, this is nothing new and rather part of a long history of the US leading allies down a primrose path to support the US's own geopolitical interest. In the case of Ukraine, the relevant geopolitical interest is of course weakening Russia. The one thing Trump can at least argue is that he is not the only one responsible for leading Ukraine down this primrose path, although he did of course contribute to it with his arming of the country during his first presidency. But the entry of the path was open during the Bush administration when Ukraine was promised eventual NATO membership and continued through the Obama presidency and accelerated during Biden's armament. Now the other question is whether others can learn from the case of Ukraine and not go down this primrose path. The biggest concern from my perspective is Taiwan. There are a lot of differences between Taiwan and Ukraine, but from the perspective of the United States, I think it is clear that they serve similar antagonistic roles with respect to larger geopolitical enemies, Russia in the case of Ukraine and China in the case of Taiwan. In recent months, although it has not gotten much media attention, it does seem to be the case that Taiwan is following Ukraine down the primrose path, with more internal policies in the country that seem to be aimed at preventing dissent against the current DPP government, which is more antagonistic to China. These efforts have included proposing bringing back military courts, expelling residents for social media posts, and buying more arms to the United States, further enriching the arms industry. I just want to make a few concluding points. One should be obvious: the US will always pursue its own self-interest, and this self-interest will include betraying and abandoning allies once it's no longer geopolitically beneficial for the United States to continue supporting them. The lessons for other countries is to be distrustful of the United States and seek diversified relationships. The United States is not the only ally that you can potentially have, and you can have potentially fruitful relationships with other countries. For those in the United States, the lesson is to try to prevent our government from leading more countries down this primrose path. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting or useful in some ways. If you have any questions or any comments or suggestions, I'm certain there are things that I missed or parts of the story that might need more attention. Please feel free to comment on the video. If these types of topics are interesting to you, especially topics related to geopolitics and how the media covers these stories, I'll recommend a book that I recently published called Worthy and Unworthy: How the Media Reports on Friends and Foes. In this book, I really apply the perspective from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book, Manufacturing Consent, to looking how the media are really comparing how the media reports on stories from geopolitical enemies and from geopolitical foes. And what I find basically is that there's much more of a focus, especially on negative stories that are coming from geopolitical foes, even when similar events happen in countries that are more friendly to the United States. So if you're interested in looking into that book more, I provide a URL and also a QR code to go to the publisher's website to take a look at the book. Thank you so much, and like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. Thanks, everyone.